What's focal length? How can I recognize different focal lengths? How do I choose the right focal length when I'm shooting something? This is a 50mm normal lens. This is a 73mm telephoto lens. This is a 100mm telephoto lens, and you're watching me through a 26mm wide-angle lens. Here's how I look like with the 50mm lens. Now with the 73mm. And here's at 100. So what's the difference between these four lenses? Well, obviously they don't look the same. But that's just an observation. The real answer has to do with what's called focal length. In physics, focal length refers to the distance between the center of a lens and its focal point. While in film and photography, focal length is used more to differentiate between lenses. Earlier, when I referred to my lenses as either 50mm or 73mm, what I was really talking about is their focal length. When you're familiar with the concept, you can easily get an idea of how any lens looks just by knowing that number. A lens with a high focal length looks more zoomed in, while a lens with a lower focal length looks zoomed out. This is because they don't have the same angle of view. A lens with a short focal length has a large angle of view. For example, a 24mm lens has a horizontal angle of view of 74 degrees and is appropriately called a wide-angle lens. On the other hand, a lens with a high focal length has a narrow angle of view. For example, a 100mm lens has a horizontal angle of view of 20 degrees and is called a telephoto lens. A zoom lens allows you to adjust its focal length. When you zoom in on a zoom lens, you're actually increasing the focal length, and when you zoom out, you're decreasing it. So as you can see, when I zoom in with my lens, the angle of view becomes more narrow, while our image looks more magnified. One of the most important questions to keep in mind when you're choosing a focal length is, how do I want my shot to look like? If you want to have a shot that looks fairly natural, that is undistorted, then you'll probably want to pick a focal length like this one, which is about 50mm. Want to encompass a wide area in a single shot, or else do you want to get closer to your subject, perhaps because you're working in a cramped environment? Then a wide-angle lens will do the job perfectly for you. Though I would keep an eye out for barrel distortions, because if you don't like their look, then you're gonna have to remove them in post. If, on the other hand, you're trying to show as little of the space as possible, or else if you want to show the subject up close, but without having to stand right in front of their faces, then a telephoto lens is best. Though you should know that they tend to give a flatter look to the image, so that might or might not be what you're going for. Ultimately, you can get all kinds of shots with the same focal length, or inversely, you can get a similar shot with all types of lenses. I can do a close-up in wide angle, or I can make it telephoto. It all depends on the look you're going for, or whether or not you're following conventions. For example, in the golden era of Hollywood, they made it a convention to always use lenses close to 100mm to photograph close-ups. They observed that that way it was the most flattering to the face. Though it made people look kind of distant. So nowadays you have famous cinematographers like Roger Deakins telling you that if you want to get a more intimate look in your close-ups, you probably want to use a wider lens. Do you know what's shot size? You can look that up easily, but in a nutshell, it describes how a shot looks like. For instance, this is a full shot. This is a medium shot, and this is a close-up. All three of these shot sizes refer to how much space I, the subject, is occupying within the frame. Moreover, I took all three of these shots using the same 50mm lens. Because something you have to know is that even though people might say, oh, this kind of lens is better for close-ups, oh, this kind of lens is better for wide shots, etc., the reality, the truth, is that every single focal length can give you any shot size. Let me make that clear. Any focal length can give you any shot size. You just have to vary the distance between you and the subject. Let me show you an example. Here I have a zoom lens mounted on my camera. It's set to 80mm. Now I'm going to progressively zoom out while walking towards my subject. This will show you that to make up for the magnification of the lens, I can just come closer to my subject, and that way my shot size will remain roughly the same even though I'm changing the focal length. And here's another example, me in full shot, taken with different focal lengths. So, as you might have noticed from the previous example, there's quite a few visible differences between the widest lens and the most telephoto. One of those differences is distortion. As I've mentioned earlier, very wide lenses have what's called a barrel distortion, which makes straight lines look rounded and like they're bulging towards us. For example, you'll often see that kind of distortion on videos shot with GoPro cameras or other action cameras. Moreover, if you place a wide-angle lens very close to your subject, then it will exaggerate perspective, and your subject will look distorted and probably larger than life, while depth will also be exaggerated, and thus the background will appear further away than it really is. This can be used creatively. For example, you can make movements that go towards or away from the camera look quicker or more intense. In contrast, telephoto lenses give the impression of flattening the image. It compresses perspective, because our perspective on the subject is taken from very far away. Unlike wide-angle lenses that can get very close to a subject while still keeping it all within the frame, thus exaggerating our perspective on the subject, a telephoto lens works a bit like when you enlarge a photo. You can make something look bigger by enlarging it, but you are stuck with the perspective you have. With a telephoto lens, you start from the perspective where you placed your camera, and you're enlarging just a little faraway portion containing your subject. The only difference between doing it with a lens or doing it in a software is that by using the lens, you'll have more pixels to work with. Furthermore, as opposed to wide-angle lenses, a telephoto shot reduces the appearance of depth. This can also be used creatively to make it look like your subject is moving very slowly towards or away from the camera. And then, to finish my comparison, a few words about depth of field. Depth of field basically refers to how much is in focus in a shot. Shots where part of the image are blurry have a shallow depth of field, while shots where everything looks sharp have a wide depth of field. And when everything is in focus, some also call it deep focus. Depth of field is mainly influenced by the aperture of the lens and the distance between the camera and the subject. Though I won't get into all the technical details of depth of field because it's a very complicated topic that is much debated on the internet, by the way, and because frankly, I don't think I totally understand how it works just yet. But here's the practical info that might help you. You might have noticed that in shots where I used a telephoto lens, I tend to look sharp while the background is slightly blurry. While in shots where I used a wider lens, everything tends to be more or less in focus. Well, as a rule of thumb, longer focal lengths have a shallower depth of field. And moreover, the closer you are to the subject, and thus the closer you focus the lens, the shallower the focus will look. To conclude, here's a recap. So lenses fall roughly within 3 categories of increasing focal length. You have wide, normal, and telephoto lenses. Lenses around 50 mm are considered by convention normal lenses because they don't distort perspective very much compared to our human vision. When you get to lower focal lengths, at 24 mm and under, you get into the realm of wide-angle lenses. These lenses offer a wide angle of view. They tend to give you a deep depth of field, and they tend to distort perspective when placed close to your subject. Inversely, when you get into higher focal lengths, starting at around 75 mm and up, you get into the area of telephoto lenses. These lenses have a narrower angle of view, which give you a more magnified look to your picture, meaning that you can capture your subject from further away. Additionally, they give you a shallower depth of field and tend to compress perspective, making the image look flatter. Moreover, this flatter image tends to be more flattering to people's faces. Therefore, to come back to my phrase from earlier, every focal length can give you any shot size, but every focal length makes your image look slightly different. In the end, choosing the right lens for your shot is a matter of knowing what kind of image you want to create. Is it a beautiful close-up, perhaps a dynamic wide shot, or perhaps a neutral medium shot, and then picking the lens whose characteristics work best with what you're going for.